Okay, great question. How does early life stress affect the brain? First thing is, in a minute, 2 minutes, there is no way I can give you a good answer to that, because the effect is just so pervasive. But let me just give you an example of something that I think probably most people can relate to with stress. When we have stress, everyone's heard of cortisol, everyone's heard of adrenaline and these sorts of chemicals, these glucocorticoids. Now, there are types of glucocorticoids that are released into the brain when we have a stress response. The frontal lobes, so that the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus are two areas that are particularly susceptible to chronic activation and release of glucocorticoids. What can actually happen over time when we have this chronic stress, particularly starting in early life, is we get a proliferation, we get an increase in glucocorticoid receptors both in the frontal cortex and in the hippocampus. So the result of that is quite extensive. One, it interferes with function, so we get changes in activation patterns of the brain, which can affect things like behaviour and capacity to learn and develop, if we're talking about the frontal lobes. And ultimately what we see in the frontal lobes is atrophy of the grey matter, atrophy of the actual part of the brain that thinks. So when we get that, we get reduced volumes and we get reduced function. Quite a serious impact for a whole host of reasons. In the hippocampus, we over time see the same thing. We see this proliferation of glucocorticoids in areas of the hippocampus and a corresponding volume reduction in areas of the hippocampus. It takes longer in the hippocampus for that to happen. Hippocampus develops a little bit more slowly, and so the developmental trajectory of the hippocampus means that what we tend to see is potentially, if we compared hippocampus of a 15-year-old who had early life stress and hippocampus of a 15-year-old who hadn't, we might not see many differences between the two. However, if we then took those same two individuals and looked at the hippocampus at 25 or 30, we would potentially start to see some quite significant changes. We'd see a much smaller hippocampus in the adult who had had early life stress than we would in the individual who hadn't. And that then affects things like learning and memory and our capacity to function and interact with the outside world. And when you combine that with the reduction in function, reduction in volumes of the frontal lobes, we have this compounded effect where not only do we have problems with getting that information in and memorising it, learning it, we also then have a problem with actually utilising it at a higher cortical level for language, for behavioural control and decision-making processes and so forth. And that is when we can have really serious impacts, and we get a whole host of other issues that come from that.